Why did my mom believe her new husband instead of my doctor when he said I was faking my cancer symptoms? The bruise on my abdomen wouldn't heal, and Dr. Patel said we needed to run tests immediately. I was 16, sitting on the examination table in a paper gown while Mom held my hand, and her new husband Derek stood in the corner scrolling through his phone. The bruise had appeared 3 weeks ago, dark purple spreading across my left side like spilled ink, and no matter how carefully I moved or how much I rested, it kept getting bigger. Dr. Patel pressed gently on the area, and I winced. She asked about other symptoms, and I told her about the exhaustion that made climbing stairs feel impossible, the night sweats that soaked through my sheets, the weight I'd lost without trying. She ordered blood work, an ultrasound, and a CT scan, saying the combination of symptoms and the persistent bruising could indicate something serious that needed immediate attention. Derek looked up from his phone and asked how much all these tests would cost. Dr. Patel said insurance would cover most of it, but Derek shook his head and said that sounded excessive for a bruise, that teenage boys got bruises all the time from sports and rough play. I told him I hadn't played sports in weeks because I was too tired, that this felt different from normal bruises. Dr. Patel agreed and explained that unexplained bruising combined with fatigue and night sweats warranted investigation because they could be signs of blood disorders or malignancies. Derek laughed and said that doctors always wanted to run expensive tests to cover themselves legally, that I probably just needed more iron in my diet and better sleep habits. Mom looked between us, her expression uncertain. She'd only been married to Derek for 4 months, and I could see her calculating whether to trust my doctor of 10 years or her new husband who worked in pharmaceutical sales and claimed to know how the medical industry operated. Dr. Patel's voice got firmer. She said this wasn't about covering liability. This was about a teenager presenting with concerning symptoms that could indicate leukemia or lymphoma, and that delaying diagnosis could be dangerous. Derek crossed his arms and told Mom that doctors scared patients into unnecessary procedures all the time, that he'd seen it constantly in his work, and that I was probably just anemic and seeking attention because I resented him being in the family. Mom's hand loosened in mine. She asked Dr. Patel if we could wait a week and see if the bruise improved with rest and better nutrition before doing expensive tests. Dr. Patel looked at me with concern and said she strongly recommended against waiting, that if this was something serious, a week could matter significantly. But Mom was already standing, telling me to get dressed, saying we'd give it a week and see how I felt. Derek put his arm around Mom's shoulders and said she was making a smart decision, not letting herself be manipulated by fear tactics. In the car, I tried to explain how wrong I felt, how the exhaustion wasn't normal tiredness, how I could feel something inside me that wasn't right. Derek turned around from the passenger seat and said I needed to stop being dramatic, that teenage boys didn't get cancer, and that I was obviously trying to sabotage Mom's happiness because I hadn't accepted him as part of the family. Mom told me Derek had a point, that I'd been difficult ever since the wedding, and maybe some of my symptoms were stress-related. The week passed, and the bruise spread further, wrapping around my side toward my back. I started finding smaller bruises on my arms and legs that appeared without cause. The exhaustion intensified until I was sleeping 12 hours a night and still waking up depleted. My appetite vanished, and eating felt like forcing down cardboard. I asked Mom to call Dr. Patel, but Derek said we'd agreed to wait and see, and that I needed to stop trying to manipulate the situation. He suggested I was Googling symptoms and convincing myself I was sick, that teenagers did this for attention. Mom agreed we should stick to the plan, give my body time to recover naturally. By the second week, I could barely get out of bed. My skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and dark circles shadowed my eyes. I showed Mom the new bruises, counted 7 on my left arm alone. She touched them gently, and I saw worry flicker across her face, but Derek said bruises clustered because blood pooled in areas of weakness, and that I was probably pressing on my arms while sleeping. He added that I should stop obsessing over every little mark, that the stress I was creating was probably making things worse. School became impossible. I'd fall asleep in class, my body too heavy to keep upright. Teachers sent me to the nurse 3 times in 1 week. The school nurse, Mrs. Reeves, called Mom and said I needed to see a doctor immediately, that my symptoms indicated something serious. Derek answered the phone and told her we had a family doctor handling it, that she should focus on her job and let us handle our family's medical decisions. Mrs. Reeves called back and asked to speak to Mom directly. When Mom got on the phone, Mrs. Reeves said she'd worked in pediatric oncology before becoming a school nurse and recognized warning signs, that she was begging Mom to get me to a hospital. Mom thanked her and hung up. Then Derek spent an hour explaining how school nurses overstepped constantly, how they saw worst-case scenarios and everything, how Mrs. Reeves was probably traumatized from her oncology work and projecting onto healthy kids. Mom nodded along, and I realized she'd rather believe Derek than face the possibility that something was catastrophically wrong with her son. 3 weeks after the initial appointment, I woke up with blood on my pillow. My nose had bled during the night, badly enough to soak through the pillowcase. I stumbled to Mom's bedroom and showed her, blood still trickling from my nostril. Derek was already awake, getting ready for work. He said nosebleeds happened, especially in dry weather, and handed me tissues. Mom asked if maybe we should call Dr. Patel now, and Derek sighed heavily, saying that if we rushed to the doctor for every nosebleed, we'd go bankrupt from medical bills. He reminded her that his insurance through work had a high deductible, and we needed to be smart about healthcare spending. Mom bit her lip and told me to use a humidifier in my room, that we'd monitor the situation. I stood there bleeding into tissues, watching my mother choose her husband's financial concerns over my deteriorating health, and something inside me understood that I might die because she loved him more than she trusted reality. My best friend Austin noticed during lunch that I hadn't eaten in days. He sat across from me in the cafeteria and asked straight out if I was okay, if something was medically wrong. I told him about the bruises, the exhaustion, the nosebleeds, how Mom wouldn't take me back to Dr. Patel because Derek said I was faking. Austin pulled out his phone and called his mom, who was an ER nurse at County General. He explained my symptoms in clinical terms he'd learned from growing up in a medical household, and I watched his face go pale as his mom responded. He hung up and said his mom wanted me at the ER immediately, that my symptoms were textbook for acute leukemia, and that if I didn't get treatment soon, I could die. I asked how I was supposed to get there when Mom wouldn't take me. Austin said his mom was finishing her shift in an hour and would pick us up from school, take me to the ER herself, and deal with my mom later. For the first time in weeks, I felt a shred of hope that someone was taking this seriously. Austin's mom, Diane, picked us up at 3:30. She took one look at me and her professional mask slipped, revealing genuine alarm. In the car, she asked me to describe everything, and when I finished, she was already calling ahead to the ER to tell them she was bringing in a possible leukemia case. At the hospital, she bypassed the waiting room and brought me straight to triage, using her hospital ID and connections to get me seen immediately. The triage nurse took my vitals, and her eyes widened at my blood pressure and heart rate. Within minutes, I was in an exam room with an ER doctor named Dr. Shapiro, who pressed on my abdomen and felt my lymph nodes, his expression growing more serious with each finding. He ordered an immediate complete blood count and told the nurse to fast-track it, that he suspected acute leukemia and needed confirmation quickly. Diane called my mom and told her to get to County General immediately, that I was in the ER and it was serious. Mom asked why I was at the hospital without her permission, and Diane said because her son was dying and she'd been ignoring it. Mom and Derek arrived 40 minutes later, both furious. Derek started yelling about how Diane had overstepped massively, how she'd kidnapped me from school and brought me to the ER without parental consent. Diane stood her ground and said that as a mandatory reporter and medical professional, she'd recognized life-threatening symptoms and acted appropriately. Dr. Shapiro came in with lab results and the room went quiet. He said my white blood cell count was critically abnormal, my platelets were dangerously low, and my blood smear showed blast cells consistent with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. He said I needed to be admitted immediately and transferred to the pediatric oncology unit for a bone marrow biopsy and treatment planning, that without intervention, I would likely die within weeks. Mom's face crumbled and she started crying. Derek said the doctor was being dramatic, that one blood test didn't mean cancer, that there could be other explanations. Dr. Shapiro looked at him with barely concealed contempt and said there was no other explanation for this constellation of findings, that I had cancer and needed emergency treatment. Derek insisted on a second opinion before admitting me anywhere. Dr. Shapiro said there wasn't time for a second opinion, that my blood counts indicated I was in crisis and could develop life-threatening complications like tumor lysis syndrome or infection at any moment. He said the hospital's pediatric oncologist, Dr. Vance, was on her way down to evaluate me and explain the treatment protocol. Derek said he wasn't letting them admit me based on one doctor's opinion, that this felt like a cash grab. Diane stepped between Derek and the doctor and told Derek that if he prevented my treatment, she would call Child Protective Services immediately and report medical neglect. Mom sobbed and asked what she should do, and Derek said they should take me home and think about this logically, not make rash decisions based on fear. Dr. Shapiro said that if they attempted to remove me from the hospital against medical advice, he would involve hospital security and social services because I was critically ill, and removing me would constitute child endangerment. Dr. Vance arrived and introduced herself as the head of pediatric oncology. She reviewed my labs and physical exam findings, then sat down with Mom and explained in detail what acute lymphoblastic leukemia was, how it had been growing in my bone marrow, crowding out healthy blood cells, and causing all my symptoms. She said I needed a bone marrow biopsy tonight to confirm the diagnosis and determine the specific subtype, then I'd begin chemotherapy immediately, probably tomorrow. The treatment would be aggressive, lasting 2 to 3 years with different phases, and would require frequent hospitalizations. Without treatment, she said I would die within a month, maybe sooner. Mom asked about the success rate, and Dr. Vance said that with proper treatment, adolescents with all had a cure rate around 85%, but only if we started immediately. Every day we delayed decreased those odds. Derek said 85% wasn't a guarantee, that chemotherapy was poison, and maybe we should look into alternative treatments first. Dr. Vance's expression hardened and she said there were no alternative treatments for acute leukemia, only chemotherapy, and that anyone suggesting otherwise was condemning me to death. Mom signed the admission papers with shaking hands while Derek stood in the corner silent and furious. I was admitted to the pediatric oncology floor, a place I'd soon know too well, with its cheerful murals trying to disguise the reality that children came here to fight for their lives. The bone marrow biopsy happened that evening, a procedure where they inserted a large needle into my hip bone and extracted marrow for analysis. The pain was extraordinary despite local anesthesia, a deep drilling sensation that made me understand my body was being invaded to find the enemy growing inside it. Dr. Vance said preliminary results confirmed all, but they needed additional testing to determine the exact genetic markers and risk category, which would determine my treatment intensity. That night, my first night in the hospital, Mom slept in the chair next to my bed while Derek went home saying someone needed to handle things at the house. I heard Mom crying softly after she thought I'd fallen asleep, and I wondered if she was crying for me or for believing Derek when everyone else had been right. Treatment started the next morning with a chemotherapy protocol that Dr. Vance explained would be divided into phases: induction to achieve remission, consolidation to eliminate remaining cancer cells, and maintenance that would last 2 years. The first infusion made me violently ill within hours, vomiting until there was nothing left, and my body just heaved uselessly. Mom held a basin and cried while nurses adjusted my medications and tried to manage the nausea. Derek visited that afternoon and said this was exactly why he'd been skeptical, that the cure looked worse than the disease, and maybe we should reconsider. Dr. Vance overheard and pulled Derek into the hallway. I couldn't hear everything, but her voice carried and I caught phrases about medical neglect, delayed diagnosis, and criminal charges. When they came back, Derek was subdued and Mom looked terrified. Dr. Vance said she'd documented the 3-week delay between my initial appointment and actual diagnosis, and that she'd be reporting it to the hospital ethics board for review. The hospital social worker, a woman named Keisha Williams, came to interview me privately about my home situation and the delayed diagnosis. I told her everything: Dr. Patel's recommendation for immediate testing, Derek's dismissal of my symptoms as attention-seeking, Mom's choice to believe him over medical professionals, the 3 weeks of deterioration. Keisha took detailed notes and said the delay had allowed my leukemia to progress further, potentially decreasing my cure rate and definitely increasing the intensity of treatment I'd need. She said the ethics board would investigate whether the delay constituted medical neglect, and if so, Child Protective Services would become involved. Mom would likely face consequences for choosing her husband's opinions over medical advice when dealing with a minor's serious illness. I asked if I'd be taken away from Mom, and Keisha said not unless they determined I was unsafe, but that my treatment decisions would be monitored closely to ensure Derek couldn't interfere again. The first week of treatment was hell. Chemotherapy ravaged my body, killing cancer cells but also attacking healthy tissue. My hair started falling out in clumps. My mouth developed painful sores that made eating impossible. My immune system crashed, and I developed a fever that spiked to 104, requiring emergency antibiotics and an ICU transfer for 24 hours. Dr. Vance explained this was called febrile neutropenia, a life-threatening complication where patients had no white blood cells to fight infection, and it was one of the leading causes of death during leukemia treatment. She said the 3-week delay had allowed my disease to progress to a higher risk category, meaning my treatment had to be more aggressive, which meant more complications. Derek had stopped visiting after the first few days. Mom said he was struggling with the situation, that hospitals made him uncomfortable. I said he was uncomfortable because he'd been wrong and nearly killed me through his arrogance, and now everyone knew it. Mom defended him weakly, saying he'd meant well, that he'd genuinely thought I was exaggerating. I asked her at what point a parent's responsibility to protect their child should override trusting a spouse's opinion, and she didn't have an answer. The ethics board investigation moved forward, and I had to give testimony about the delayed diagnosis. The board consisted of doctors, nurses, and patient advocates who reviewed my case and determined that Mom and Derek's decision to ignore Dr. Patel's recommendations for 3 weeks, despite escalating symptoms, constituted medical neglect that had directly harmed my prognosis. They referred the case to Child Protective Services, who opened a formal investigation. A CPS caseworker named Raymond Diaz came to interview me in the hospital, asking detailed questions about Derek's behavior, his influence over Mom's medical decisions, and whether I felt safe at home. I told him I felt safe from physical harm, but not safe from medical neglect, that if something happened to me again, Derek would convince Mom to delay treatment, and I could die. Raymond said that was enough to justify intervention and that he'd be recommending supervised medical decision-making, meaning Mom couldn't make healthcare choices for me without CPS oversight until I turned 18. Austin visited regularly, bringing homework and news from school, trying to maintain some normalcy in my cancer-centered existence. He told me Derek had been bragging at his work about how he'd been proven right about unnecessary medical testing, that the doctors had run all those expensive tests and scans, and I'd just needed iron supplements and rest. When Austin's mom heard this, she contacted Derek's employer and provided documentation of my leukemia diagnosis, explaining that Derek's refusal to allow testing had delayed my diagnosis and worsened my prognosis. Derek's company worked in pharmaceutical sales, and having an employee who publicly dismissed cancer symptoms and discouraged medical treatment was a liability they couldn't accept. Derek was fired 3 weeks after my diagnosis, not for the medical neglect itself, but because his judgment and public statements created risk for a company dependent on medical credibility. Mom was devastated by his firing, but I felt no sympathy. Actions had consequences, and Derek was finally facing some for nearly killing me through stubborn arrogance. Chemotherapy continued relentlessly. I spent more time in the hospital than at home, my life reduced to treatment cycles, blood counts, and side effects. My body became foreign, skeletal, and bald and scarred from dozens of needle sticks. The Make-A-Wish Foundation reached out, and I told them I didn't want a trip or celebrity meeting. I just wanted to be healthy again, wanted to rewind 4 months and have Mom trust Dr. Patel instead of Derek. They couldn't grant that wish. Dr. Vance said my response to treatment was complicated by the delay, that the cancer had been more established and required more aggressive intervention. The statistics she'd quoted about 85% cure rates applied to patients treated promptly. My delayed diagnosis dropped me into a lower prognostic category with cure rates closer to 70%. That 15% difference represented the cost of Derek's ego and Mom's misplaced trust. A 15% greater chance I'd die because they'd waited 3 weeks to take my symptoms seriously. Month 3 brought a new crisis when I developed severe abdominal pain, and imaging showed I had typhlitis, an infection of the intestinal wall that occurred in immunocompromised patients. It required emergency surgery to remove the affected section of bowel and weeks of intravenous antibiotics. Dr. Vance said this complication was more common in patients with advanced disease at diagnosis, another consequence of the delayed treatment. I spent my 17th birthday recovering from intestinal surgery, connected to machines that breathed and ate and eliminated from me, wondering how much more my body could endure before it gave up entirely. Mom sat beside my ICU bed and finally admitted she'd made a terrible mistake believing Derek, that she'd wanted so badly for her new marriage to work that she'd ignored evidence her son was dying. I told her wanting something didn't excuse endangering your child's life, and she nodded and cried, but the acknowledgement felt empty because the damage was done. Derek and Mom separated during my 4th month of treatment. Derek claimed he couldn't handle the stress and constant hospital visits, but really, he couldn't handle being blamed for nearly killing his stepson. Mom filed for divorce, and Derek didn't contest it, probably grateful to escape before criminal charges materialized. Child Protective Services recommended against prosecution after Mom completed parenting classes and demonstrated understanding of her failure, but they maintained oversight of my medical care. The divorce proceedings revealed Derek had been stealing money from my college fund to pay gambling debts, adding another layer of betrayal. Mom had to take a second job to cover the portions of my medical bills insurance didn't pay, working nights while spending days at the hospital with me. She looked exhausted and broken, aged 10 years and 4 months. Month 6 of treatment, halfway through induction and consolidation phases, Dr. Vance ordered a bone marrow biopsy to check my remission status. The wait for results felt eternal. Remission meant the treatment was working, that the cancer cells were gone from my marrow and I'd moved to the less intensive maintenance phase. Not achieving remission meant my leukemia was resistant, my prognosis significantly worse, possibly requiring a bone marrow transplant if we could find a donor. Dr. Vance came to my room with results, and her carefully neutral expression told me nothing. She said my marrow showed minimal residual disease, meaning some cancer cells remained detectable at microscopic levels. This wasn't complete remission, which meant my treatment protocol had to be intensified. More chemo, more hospitalizations, more complications. She explained this was a direct consequence of the advanced disease at diagnosis, that patients treated promptly had better remission rates. I'd been dealt a harder fight because of those 3 lost weeks. Austin's mom, Diane, became an unofficial advocate, helping Mom navigate the medical system and treatment decisions. She explained test results, asked doctors questions Mom was too overwhelmed to formulate, and provided emotional support when Mom broke down from exhaustion and guilt. Diane also documented everything related to the delayed diagnosis, suspecting Mom might need legal protection if Derek tried to shift blame. She was right. Derek filed a countersuit in the divorce proceedings claiming Mom had been the one refusing medical treatment for me, that he'd encouraged her to listen to doctors. Diane provided her testimony and the ER records showing Derek's behavior the day I was finally diagnosed. The judge dismissed Derek's claims and awarded Mom full custody of me with a restraining order preventing Derek from interfering in my medical care. The divorce was finalized 7 months after my diagnosis, erasing Derek from our lives legally if not psychologically. The intensified chemotherapy protocol brought me close to death multiple times. I developed pneumonia that required intubation and mechanical ventilation. My kidneys started failing from the toxic medications and I needed temporary dialysis. My liver enzymes spiked so high, Dr. Vance had to pause treatment and hope my liver recovered before the leukemia grew back. Each complication extended my treatment time, pushed my cure rates lower, stacked risk upon risk. Mom blamed herself constantly, apologizing until the words lost meaning. I told her apologies didn't undo damage, that saying sorry didn't heal organs destroyed by delayed treatment. She needed to live with what she'd done, with the consequences of choosing a man she barely knew over medical professionals and her dying son. That knowledge would be her punishment, heavier than any court could impose. Month 12, 1 year since diagnosis, I finally achieved remission. Dr. Vance said all detectable cancer cells were gone from my marrow, but I'd still need 18 more months of maintenance chemotherapy to prevent relapse. I'd lost a year of my life to treatment, missed my entire junior year, and would graduate late if I survived. My body was permanently damaged, heart weakened from chemotherapy, hearing loss from antibiotics, cognitive deficits from methotrexate that went to my brain. The list of long-term effects read like a medical nightmare, and Dr. Vance said I'd need monitoring for secondary cancers and organ failure for the rest of my life. Surviving leukemia wasn't a return to normal life. It was trading one set of medical problems for another. But at least I'd survived the part where I could have died if someone had taken my symptoms seriously when they first appeared. Mrs. Reeves, the school nurse who'd called Mom during my decline, visited me in the hospital and brought cards from students I barely remembered. She said she'd been following my case through Austin's mom, that she'd felt helpless watching my deterioration those 3 weeks, while my parents ignored her warnings. She'd reported Mom to CPS herself after my diagnosis, providing documentation of her calls and concerns. Her report had been part of the evidence the ethics board used to establish medical neglect. I thanked her for trying to help when my own mother wouldn't listen. She said she'd worked in pediatric oncology long enough to know that some parents couldn't accept devastating diagnoses. That denial was easier than facing their child's mortality, but that denial killed children who could have been saved. Mom's denial, encouraged by Derek's arrogance, had nearly killed me, and Mrs. Reeves wanted me to know that professionals had tried to intervene. The maintenance phase of treatment was less intense but lasted 2 years, requiring daily oral chemotherapy and monthly clinic visits. I returned to school for senior year, bald and frail, and different from the kid who'd left 16 months earlier. People stared. Some asked questions about cancer that I didn't want to answer. Others avoided me entirely, scared by proximity to mortality in someone their own age. Austin remained my closest friend, the only person who'd been there since before and understood who I'd been versus who I'd become. College plans changed entirely. I'd wanted to study engineering, but cognitive deficits from treatment made complex math difficult. I decided on pre-med instead, wanting to become the doctor who listened to symptoms and advocated for patients against dismissive family members. Dr. Patel, who'd tried to diagnose me promptly, wrote a recommendation letter for my medical school applications that explained my journey from misdiagnosed patient to aspiring physician. 2 years after diagnosis, I completed my final dose of maintenance chemotherapy. Dr. Vance said I was officially in remission and off treatment, though I'd need surveillance scans and blood work every 3 months for 5 years. She said my prognosis was now about 60% chance of cure, meaning I'd likely survive but might relapse. The 15% lower cure rate compared to patients diagnosed promptly represented the permanent cost of Derek's interference and Mom's failure. Dr. Vance documented in my medical records that the delayed diagnosis had directly impacted my long-term survival odds, creating a permanent medical record of the harm caused. If I relapsed, if the cancer came back because it hadn't been caught early enough, that delay would be the reason. Mom would have to live with knowing her choices might still kill me years after the initial diagnosis. I graduated high school 2 years late, standing on stage bald but healthy enough to walk across for my diploma. Mom cried in the audience. Derek wasn't there. He'd moved to another state after the divorce, and I'd heard he'd remarried someone with no children. College started at the State University, where I studied biology and chemistry, laying groundwork for medical school. My cancer experience became my identity in ways I resented, but it had shaped everything about who I was and what I wanted to do. I wanted to be the doctor who believed patients, who ordered tests despite family skepticism, who advocated fiercely for children against neglectful parents. I wanted to be what Dr. Patel had tried to be and what Dr. Vance had been, a voice that couldn't be silenced by someone's arrogant ignorance. 5 years after diagnosis, my surveillance scans remained clear. Dr. Vance said I'd officially reached the 5-year remission milestone, meaning my risk of relapse dropped significantly, and I could be considered cured, with the caveat that late relapses could still occur. I'd survived the cancer and the delayed diagnosis and the complications from both. Mom and I had a complicated relationship now, not estranged, but not close, both of us carrying the weight of what had happened. She'd completed years of therapy, processing her guilt and learning to make better decisions. She never remarried and focused on working to pay off my medical debt, which had reached 6 figures despite insurance. I helped when I could, but reminded her this was consequence of her choices, not something I owed her assistance with. Medical school accepted me, and I started studying oncology, driven by the memory of being a terrified 16-year-old whose mother chose her husband over his life. I'd become the doctor I'd needed, the one who fought for patients even when their families didn't. That was how I transformed Derek's arrogance and Mom's failure into something meaningful, turning my survival into a promise that I'd never let another kid suffer what I'd endured because the adults around them refused to believe they were dying. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.